A dying German Shepherd puppy was brought to the clinic for a final goodbye. But just as the pen hovered over the euthanasia form, the pup gently placed a paw on his owner's chest, and his eyes lit up with something no one could explain. Why did the young vet suddenly hesitate? And what secret did the puppy uncover with just a single breath? What happened next will make you believe in miracles. The clock on the dashboard had stopped blinking frozen at 3:47 p.m. But time, as far as Elias Grant was concerned, had stopped much earlier. The old pickup truck rumbled along the gravel road, its engine coughing every few miles like it too was carrying the weight of this final journey. Elias kept both hands firmly on the cracked steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the leather-wrapped grip that had long since absorbed sweat ash, sash, and the faint scent of dog fur. Beside him, curled awkwardly in a fleece blanket that once lived in the back seat, was Milo, the little German Shepherd pup, who had once bounded through firehouse hallways like he was built of sparks and sunshine. Now his tiny body, no bigger than a half-grown raccoon, lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his ribcage. His fur, once a glossy patchwork of black and tan, had dulled at the edges, and his nose twitched intermittently, as if trying to locate a scent that might pull him back to life. Elias glanced sideways at him, then quickly back at the road, not because he couldn't look longer, but because if he did, the trembling in his chest might break loose. "Almost there, buddy," he said softly, the words rough, nearly swallowed by the sound of tires on gravel. Milo didn't lift his head. He only blinked once slowly and returned to staring out the window. Eyes glazed yet still faintly golden, as if the last bit of sunlight was resting quietly behind them. It was just another Wednesday in a small town where nothing changed and nothing dramatic ever happened. But inside the cabin of that truck, the world was quietly ending. The veterinary clinic was just ahead Willow Creek Animal Hospital, a modest building with peeling white paint and a sign that creaked each time the wind passed through the trees. Elias pulled into the lot parked near the door and turned off the ignition. The truck shuddered once like a sigh and then went still. Elias took a moment before moving. He looked out through the windshield at the front door of the clinic that he'd walked through a dozen times for checkups and vaccinations, and one unfortunate incident with a chew toy lodged between Milo's baby teeth. But this time was different. There was no treat waiting at the counter, no cheerful tail wagging, no bouncing paws, eager to explore. He reached over, ran a hand gently along Milo's back, the fur warm but trembling slightly, and whispered, "Time to go in, little guy." He lifted the puppy as carefully as he could, cradling him like something already half gone. Milo's head lolled briefly against Elias's arm, but he didn't resist. That was what made it worse. Milo had always resisted. The leash, the bath, the closed door, the idea of bedtime. He was the firehouse's troublemaker, the puppy who thought stairs were meant to be launched off and boots were chewable targets. And now there was no protest left. Inside the clinic, the air was too clean, too sterile, and the lighting too harsh. It smelled like antiseptic and sadness. Elias stepped into the waiting room and immediately felt the hush of recognition. Pet owners looked up from their magazines or phones and quickly looked away, their faces softening with silent sympathy. Everyone always knew what it meant when someone walked in carrying an animal wrapped in a blanket, too still, too quiet. The receptionist, a young woman in scrubs with a pin of a cartoon cat on her chest, offered a gentle smile. "Mr. Grant?" she asked. "Yes, Elias Grant. We have a 4 o'clock appointment." She nodded, her fingers typing something quickly into the computer. "Dr. Tran will be with you shortly. You can wait here, or if you prefer, we can set you up in one of the quiet rooms." "Quiet's good," Elias murmured, shifting Milo slightly in his arms. "He likes quiet." She led him through a side hallway to room 2. It smelled faintly of lavender and lemon cleaner. On the wall hung a poster of a golden retriever wearing a graduation cap. On the counter sat a box of tissues. Elias sat in the chair near the corner and placed Milo gently on the padded table. The puppy whimpered a soft, uncertain sound that felt more like breath than voice, and Elias pressed a hand to his chest, instinctively feeling the quick flutter of a heart that was still trying despite everything. He waited. Each minute was longer than the last. Then came the sound of footsteps in the hallway light, measured and precise. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside wearing a white lab coat and a tired smile. She had warm brown eyes framed by rectangular glasses and hair tied into a low ponytail. The name on her badge read, Dr. Ellie Tran. Mr. Grant, she said, eyes moving quickly from Elias's face to the pup lying limp on the table. Yes. She stepped forward, her smile softening into something more reverent. I'm Dr. Tran. I read through Milo's file earlier. I'm so sorry you're here for this today. Elias nodded but didn't speak. Ellie moved closer and reached gently for the edge of the blanket, slowly uncovering the pup's face. Milo blinked, and that's when it happened. Milo's ears twitched, not both, but just one at first, the way they used to when he caught the sound of kibble hitting a ceramic bowl. His nose, dull and dry for days, began to quiver. Then, with a surprising burst of effort, he lifted his head a few inches off the table and sniffed the air toward Ellie. It was brief, barely a second, but unmistakable. Ellie froze. She glanced at Elias. Did he just... Elias stared, stunned. He hasn't moved like that all week. Milo tried again, a short, weak exhale through the nose, but this time his paws shifted too, as if trying to crawl across the table toward her. The movement was clumsy, slow, and yet filled with purpose. Ellie knelt down to Milo's level, her face now only inches from his. Her expression changed. The practiced calm of a veterinarian gave way to something startled, something deeply human. Her eyes were wide now, unblinking. She looked at Milo like he was a ghost or a dream made real. She whispered, "That scar," under his eye. Her hand rose slowly and touched the tiny, nearly invisible scar above Milo's right cheekbone, the one Elias always said made him look like a pirate pup. "I know this dog," she said, her voice barely audible. "It can't be, but I know him." Elias straightened in his seat. "You've met Milo before?" "No," Ellie said, eyes never leaving Milo. "But I think he saved my life." The room fell silent again, but this silence wasn't sterile. It was charged electric, with memory fogged with disbelief. Ellie stood slowly, breath catching her hand, still hovering over Milo's trembling side. "I was a child," she began almost to herself. "There was a fire, an apartment building. I was trapped under a collapsed floor. It was so dark, and I remember something warm, something breathing next to me in the dust. I remember fur and eyes." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "I remember a puppy who didn't leave me, who stayed there with me no matter how scared I was." Elias's eyes widened, realization dawning like sunlight through smoke. "That was 9 years ago," he said. "Pineview Apartments. You were the girl in Unit 3C. Ellie nodded slowly, eyes shining. "I never forgot him. I didn't think I'd ever see him again." Milo shifted again on the table. His nose reached toward her hand, and this time, when she touched him, his tail moved barely, just a soft tap against the table. But it was enough. Enough to say, "I remember you too." Enough to say, this wasn't goodbye just yet. And Ellie, stunned into stillness just moments earlier, now moved with sudden clarity. She turned to Elias with renewed urgency in her voice. "I don't think we should do this yet. I want to check everything. Run new tests. Just, please let me make sure. Let me make absolutely sure we're not missing something." Elias looked at her, then back at the puppy, who had somehow found the strength to move, to recognize, to respond, not out of survival instinct, but something deeper, something almost human. He nodded slowly. Outside the examination room, the clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the world remained unchanged. But inside, a strange ripple had begun, as if the weight of memory scent and the invisible bond between a scared child and a loyal pup had somehow started to bend reality itself. And as Ellie reached for the stethoscope on the counter, with hands that trembled less, now Milo closed his eyes, not in resignation, but in the kind of rest that only comes when you know someone finally remembers exactly who you are. It was still dark when the alarm sounded, one of those cold spring mornings that didn't feel like spring at all, where the wind cut through turnout gear like glass and the scent of burning insulation clung to everything. Captain Elias Grant was already halfway into his boots when the radio came alive with urgency, structure fire, multiple calls, Pineview Apartments, reports of people trapped inside. He didn't need to hear it twice. The fire truck roared through the pre-dawn streets of Springfield like a beast with no patience, its lights cutting through fog and silence, its siren splitting the morning like a scream. Elias sat at the front helmet, tilted slightly, jaw-tight eyes scanning the map in his head. Pineview was an old building, 3 stories of concrete and wood paneling tucked behind a strip mall. Elias had responded there before for alarms, false calls, a kitchen fire once. But this would be different. In the seat beside him, almost lost in a custom-sized harness and wriggling with anticipation, was Milo, a 3-month-old German Shepherd pup with ears still too big for his head and paws that thudded every time he tried to jump higher than he should. Milo was new, barely past basic search and scent training, still learning the difference between a toy and a rescue dummy, still getting distracted by crickets. But something about him had made Elias say yes when they offered to place him in the department's new K9 pilot program. Something in those eyes. That mixture of curiosity and determination. That readiness to work. "All right, little man," Elias muttered, glancing down as Milo shifted with excitement. Time to see if all that training sticks. As they turned onto Pineview Avenue, the sky glowed orange, not from the sunrise, but from the fire that had already claimed half the structure. Smoke billowed out like a monster taking shape. The building was groaning, one whole corner already collapsed into a mound of broken wood, shattered windows, and rebar twisted like vines. Residents were gathered on the sidewalk in various states of panic. Some barefoot, some crying, some coughing violently into towels and shirts. But the real silence came from the building itself, from the spaces behind those flames, where no one had emerged. Elias jumped out before the truck fully stopped. He barked orders with a voice honed by 20 years on the job. "Engine 2. Get water on the north side. Ladder 3, start clearing that second-floor hallway." He turned to Milo, kneeling in front of the pup, who was suddenly still ears alert, nose twitching. "Milo," Elias said, clipping the miniature search vest into place. "I need you to focus. There are people in there. I need you to find them." Milo's ears flicked forward at the word "find." He understood that one. Together they crossed into the smoke. The heat was immediate, the kind that didn't feel like fire, but like weight. It pressed down on them, pushed against their lungs, filled their ears with the roar of flame and collapsing drywall. Milo's little paws danced across the scorched tile, and his nose led the way. Elias followed close, calling out as he went. "Fire department, call out." The first sweep came up empty, then a second. But on the third, near what had once been the east stairwell, Milo froze. He barked sharp, insistent, then turned in a quick circle, nose pointed toward a pile of rubble that barely rose more than 3 feet high. Elias crouched, aiming his flashlight. "Milo, stay." The pup obeyed, tail still, body trembling with restrained instinct, as Elias dropped to his belly and inched forward. What he saw would never leave him. There, curled in a space no larger than a coffin, was a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, her face streaked with ash, her blonde hair gray from soot, and her pink pajamas torn at the sleeve. One arm was tucked tightly across her chest, the other curled beneath her. She was trying not to cry, trying to be brave, but her eyes were wide with terror. Elias's voice softened, took on a tone he hadn't used since his daughter Clara was small. "Hey there, sweetheart. You awake?" The girl flinched, then nodded weakly. "My name's Elias. I'm with the fire department, and I brought someone with me who's very good at finding lost people." Milo barked once, then lay down belly flat, scooting forward until his snout touched the edge of the debris near the girl. She blinked at him. "A dog, yep. That's Milo. He's still learning, but he's already kind of a hero." The girl let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but it caught midway and turned into a cough. "My arm. It hurts." Elias nodded. "I bet. It looks like it might be broken. But you're doing great, okay? You're safe now. What about my mom?" Elias hesitated. "We're still looking for her. What's your name, sweetheart, Ellie?" "Ellie Tran." He repeated it to himself gently. "Ellie. Okay. We're going to get you out of here." Milo inched closer, and this time Ellie reached out with her uninjured hand, fingers trembling, and touched the soft fur along his head. "He's warm." "Yep," Elias smiled. "And he's not going anywhere without you." That was a promise Elias didn't say lightly. The structure above them creaked. Something cracked. No more time for planning. Elias keyed his radio. "This is Captain Grant. I've got a child approximately 9 years old, conscious, possible fracture, trapped under northeast stairwell debris. Requesting immediate extraction support." "Copy." That came the reply. "That zone's unstable. Proceed with extreme caution." Elias looked back at Milo, who now lay beside Ellie, his body curled protectively against hers, one tiny paw resting across her ankle. He didn't move, didn't twitch, didn't even blink. He was a wall of fur and heat and calm. Elias whispered, "You keep her warm, Milo. I'll clear the way." Piece by piece he began to dig. The next 20 minutes blurred into muscle memory. Dust, splinters, broken beams, shards of glass, all of it clawed aside by Elias's gloved hands. He created a channel just wide enough for Ellie to be guided through, and the whole time Milo never shifted from her side. When it was time to move, Ellie's face had changed. Less fear now, more focus. "You ready, kiddo?" Elias asked. "I think so," she said. She tried crawling, but winced as her arm bumped debris. Milo, sensing her struggle, moved beside her, slowly, gently, allowing her to drape her hand over his back for balance. And just like that, they crawled together through the rubble, one hand on a pup's back, one man pulling from ahead. When they emerged into daylight, the crowd gasped. Ellie's mother, Amanda Tran, a nurse at Springfield General, came sprinting through the crowd with tears streaking her cheeks. She dropped to her knees and pulled Ellie into her arms, sobbing, whispering prayers. Ellie, breathless and dusty, whispered one thing before the paramedics took her. "Thank you, Milo." The puppy wagged his tail slowly, tiredly. That night, Elias would sit on the tailgate of the fire truck, Milo curled beside him, in a bundle of blankets, still smelling faintly of smoke, with a tiny cut above one eye. "That's a scar, little man," Elias said softly. "You earned it." Milo licked his hand in reply. What none of them knew then was that this moment, this rescue, this impossible survival, was only the beginning. And deep in the folds of Ellie's memory, buried beneath smoke and fear, something small and warm and breathing would stay with her forever. The room had settled into the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from the weight of something irreversible. The sort of silence where every sound feels too loud, where the tick of a clock becomes a drumbeat and the rustle of paper echoes like thunder. Elias sat hunched over the clipboard, pen in hand, the words on the form swimming slightly before his eyes. Consent for euthanasia. Cremation preference. Quality of life scale. Cold, efficient lines, reducing love and grief into checkboxes. Across from him, Milo lay on the examination table, his tiny body curled into a shape so still it barely seemed alive. The soft fleece blanket beneath him cradled him like a nest. His breathing was shallow but steady, and his ears barely moved now, except for the occasional twitch at a sudden noise. He hadn't barked in days, hadn't chased shadows, hadn't tried to wriggle out of the leash or nuzzle Elias's hand with that familiar insistence. He had simply faded. And Elias, heart raw and unsure, told himself this was mercy, that letting go was a kindness, that love sometimes looked like release. Still, his hand hesitated above the paper. The pen hovered near the line where his name would finalize everything. He glanced down at Milo, his voice a rasp. "You've done enough, kid. You can rest now." That's when it happened. Milo stirred, not much, not dramatically, but with a suddenness that made Elias sit up straighter. The puppy shifted slightly under the blanket, then slowly, deliberately lifted one paw. He raised it with tremulous effort, his tiny leg shaking under its own weight, and placed it gently, insistently on Elias's chest, right over his heart. Elias froze. The contact was light, barely more than a touch, but it landed like a strike. The puppy's eyes were open now, brighter than they had been in days. Not sharp, not playful, but alert in a way that went deeper than the body. Eyes that reached past pain and exhaustion. Eyes that carried memory. Eyes that said, "I see you." Elias looked at Milo, blinking fast against the sudden rush of emotion rising in his throat. "Milo," he whispered. The puppy didn't move his paw. It stayed there steady despite the trembling, a heartbeat beneath a paw. A gesture simple enough to be instinct, but impossibly human in its precision. From across the room, Dr. Ellie Tran had been organizing medication on the counter. She turned at the sound of Elias's voice, and her breath caught. She saw it too. She stepped closer, her expression changing from professional calm to something far more intimate. Concern, awe, a quiet recognition that something unspeakable was unfolding in front of them. "He's touching you," she said softly. Elias nodded, unable to find words. Ellie leaned over the table. "That's not reflex. That's intention." Milo looked at her, then his golden eyes locking with hers. And suddenly, Ellie wasn't a vet standing in a clinic anymore. She was a child again, beneath collapsed timber-breathing smoke and fear, her tiny hand gripping soft fur. That warmth, that presence, that sense of being held together by something wordless but unbreakable. "He remembers," she whispered. Her fingers reached out and hovered just above Milo's paw. She didn't want to break the connection, only honor it. Her voice trembled. "He's telling us something." Elias finally spoke. "He's not ready." Ellie met his gaze, nodding slowly. "I don't think he is. And I think we've been wrong." She turned away from the euthanasia preparation tray, her hands moving with newfound clarity. She opened a drawer and pulled out a new patient chart, grabbed a fresh set of gloves, and wheeled over a portable scanner. "What are you doing?" Elias asked, voice still catching in his throat. "I'm starting over," she said. "I don't trust the old diagnosis anymore. Not after that." That wasn't a dog giving up. That was a dog saying, "Wait." Elias watched as she moved more alive now than at any point since he'd arrived. You think there's a chance I don't know, she admitted. But I know that look. I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of it. I was once the one trapped under rubble, too far gone, scared, small. And that same pair of eyes found me in the dark and told me I wasn't alone. She looked at Milo again. I thought it was a dream. I didn't know it was him until today. Her hands were already working, checking Milo's pulse, listening to his heart, shining a light into his pupils. She called for a blood panel, instructed the tech to run fresh scans, and pulled up the old x-rays onto the light board. Elias sat beside the table, his hand now resting gently on Milo's back. The pup's breathing had changed, still labored but steadier, more rhythmic, as if something in the room had shifted something that flowed back into his bones. Time passed in small, deliberate motions. Ellie worked with the care of someone building a second chance piece by fragile piece. When she pulled up the original x-rays again, she stared at them for a long moment. Her brow furrowed, then softened, then furrowed again. These masses, she said quietly, pointing at the hazy shapes near Milo's abdomen. They looked like tumors to the vet who examined him last month. That's what the report says. Suspected abdominal cancer. But Elias leaned forward. They don't look like cancer to me. Not anymore. Look at the edges. They're too smooth. The density's wrong, and there's no sign of metastasis. She pulled down another chart from the wall, a textbook example of canine tumors, and placed it beside Milo's scan. You see this? She asked. Elias squinted. Yeah. Now compare. Milo's images don't match. A pause. Ellie's fingers drummed once on the side of the screen. What if she said slowly, "This isn't cancer at all"? Elias stood now. Then what is it? She looked at Milo, who had turned his head toward her again, nose twitching ever so slightly. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I'm going to find out. As the lab technician entered with the tray for blood work, Milo didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. In fact, he raised his paw, his other paw this time, and allowed the tech to shave a small patch of fur. The puppy's eyes remained locked on Elias, as if he knew this was the moment. The test that might mean everything. He's cooperating, the tech whispered. It's like he knows. Ellie nodded. He does. He's always known. She turned to Elias. I want to hold off on everything. No injections, no assumptions. Give me a few hours to run this. Let's just wait. Elias didn't hesitate. Do whatever you need. And just like that, the death sentence was suspended, not erased, not forgotten, but challenged. Later that hour, Elias stood by the window of the clinic's back hallway, watching the wind toy with the edges of the American flag on the pole out front. Cars came and went. People walked in with pets wrapped in blankets, but none had the look he carried now, something between mourning and awe, between surrender and a strange, rising hope. He looked down at the palm of his shirt where Milo had rested his paw. The memory of it lingered like heat. That touch had said everything. Not yet. Not like this. Inside the exam room, Milo had curled again onto his side this time. Not like a creature giving up, but like a tired soul conserving energy for what came next. His breaths were deeper now, more even. His tail lay still but no longer limp, more like it was waiting for a reason to move again. And Ellie, seated at the desk, with Milo's chart spread across her lap, was reviewing notes, highlighting anomalies, sketching new possibilities. Somewhere in that stack of assumptions and ink, there was still room for the unexpected. Because sometimes, what looks like the end is just a place where the story takes a breath. And Milo, tiny and trembling with eyes that had seen both smoke and light, had just reached out and touched the one thing that could still be moved. A heart that hadn't fully let go. The blood work came back faster than expected. Ellie Tran stood motionless by the computer screen in the corner of the exam room. Her eyes scanning numbers she had read 100 times before: liver enzymes, white cell count, electrolyte balance, inflammation markers. But this time something in the patterns tugged at her chest like a whisper she hadn't heard in years. She squinted, leaned closer, and read again. Elevated white cells, she murmured under her breath, fingertips trailing down the page. But not consistent with neoplasia. Elias, sitting across the room with Milo's blanket still draped across his lap, looked up. That's cancer, right? Neoplasia. Ellie nodded slowly, still staring at the screen. Yes. But this isn't following the pattern. If this were a widespread tumor, we'd see different indicators: a shift in red cells, a drop in platelets, liver failure markers. But this... Her voice trailed off. She clicked on another tab, brought up comparative graphs overlays from the earlier misdiagnosis. It looks more like a toxin response, she said, finally stepping back slightly as the weight of the realization began to settle in. Elias straightened in his seat. You mean he was poisoned? I don't know for sure yet, Ellie said cautiously. But it's possible. His system is fighting something definitely. But the way it's doing it, the inflammation markers, the enzyme ratios, this isn't what I'd expect from end-stage cancer. It looks more like something external triggered a systemic reaction. Milo, curled up on the exam table with his head resting on his front paws, let out a quiet huff as if somehow validating the diagnosis. His ears twitched at the sound of Ellie's voice. She walked over and knelt beside him again, brushing a gentle hand along his neck. You're still in there, aren't you? She whispered. Still watching. Still working. And then, as if to answer her, Milo shifted. He raised his head slowly and began to sniff. Not at the air or the blanket or even Elias, but directly at her. Ellie froze, letting him move. His nose brushed past her wrist, then her forearm. He paused briefly at her elbow, then, with growing urgency, sniffed at her chest, then down, and stopped just below her sternum. He sniffed once, twice, then looked up at her. Head tilted, ears forward, nose working furiously. Ellie blinked. What are you? Milo repeated the gesture, nose to her abdomen, then back to her eyes. Elias stood now, concern crossing his face. What's he doing? Ellie opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find words. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach. It was then, in that exact moment, standing in a fluorescent-lit room flanked by an exhausted man and a dying puppy, that Ellie Tran remembered something she'd ignored for weeks. She was late. 2 weeks late. The thought hit her like a silent bolt, sudden and personal, and yet surrounded by the strangest kind of clarity. She had been brushing off the nausea, the fatigue, blaming it on work stress, night shifts, too much caffeine. But now, with a sick puppy pressing his nose into her belly like a living stethoscope, it was impossible to ignore. Oh my God, she whispered. Elias furrowed his brow. Milo wagged his tail once, a soft beat against the blanket, and rested his head back on the table, as if satisfied with the message delivered. Ellie sat down slowly, her hand still pressed lightly to her lower abdomen. She didn't look panicked. She looked stunned, like someone who had just walked through a door she didn't know existed. I think, she said carefully, I might be pregnant. Elias blinked. You're serious? She nodded slowly. I haven't tested. I didn't even think to, but the way Milo's reacting, I've read about this. Dogs can detect pregnancy, hormonal changes, elevated levels of HCG in sweat or breath or even skin. Some dogs pick it up before a test strip does. Elias exhaled, part disbelief, part awe, and he caught it. Yes, she said, almost laughing. Of course he did. They both looked at Milo. He was already dozing again. His breathing still labored, but his eyes, just half-lidded, carried a quiet satisfaction. You're still doing your job, huh? Elias murmured, stepping closer to the table. Even now, still alert, still protecting. Ellie stood again, her expression shifting. If his nose is this sharp, she said, her voice firmer, then his brain is still clear. He's not fading. He's still functioning, still responding. Which means this isn't the end. We might be fighting something else entirely. She walked to the wall where Milo's original scans were clipped to the light board. The ghostly outlines of his chest, abdomen, spine, all backlit, all reinterpreted now through a new lens. "Let's look again," she whispered. Elias stepped beside her, peering at the images, this time with eyes no longer dulled by defeat. "You see that shadow here?" Ellie pointed, tracing along the shape near Milo's lower ribs. Elias nodded. "That's what they called a tumor, right?" "Yes," she said. "But now, I'm not sure. Look at the edges. They're soft, uneven, could be a foreign object, could be inflammation. Tumors, especially aggressive ones, don't usually look like that." She grabbed a marker and circled the area, then moved to the next scan. And here, this density, it's not consistent with cancerous tissue. It's too isolated. No spread. No lymph node swelling. She stepped back and crossed her arms. "I don't think Milo's dying from cancer," she said quietly. "I think he's reacting to something that's making his body act like he's sick." "Like a false alarm?" Elias asked. "Like a false enemy," she replied. There was a long silence as the two stood together in front of the illuminated images, two professionals, bound by instinct and memory, brought together, again by a dog who had once saved one, and now was asking to be saved in return. Elias turned toward her. "So what now?" Ellie drew in a long breath, her fingers already reaching for her stethoscope again. "Now we test everything. Again. We run a full toxicology panel. We check for poisoning, chemical exposure, environmental triggers. I want to swab his paws, his fur. I want to know where he's been, what he's eaten, what he's touched." Her voice grew steadier, the tempo building with her conviction. "I want to make absolutely sure we're not letting this puppy go because someone made a mistake on a scan." Elias felt something flicker inside him, a strange lightness, not quite hope. But maybe the room where hope could live. And Milo, perhaps sensing the renewed rhythm in the room, stretched his paws out on the table. A tiny movement, but filled with intent, and blinked toward the ceiling as if waiting to see what would happen next. Ellie looked over her shoulder once more, her voice soft but clear. "I was ready to let him go," she said. "But now I think maybe he's not ready to let go of us." Outside the clinic, the sky was shifting gray clouds, parting slightly to let a strip of amber light peek through, cutting across the parking lot, sliding up the front steps and reaching through the glass of the waiting room window like a quiet invitation. And inside that little room, with blood results on the screen, X-rays reinterpreted, and the unmistakable scent of something new beginning. Milo exhaled once more, this time not from pain, but from something close to peace. Because somewhere beneath his ribs, wrapped inside his tired little chest, there was still a spark, a glimmer, a pulse that hadn't stopped believing. The early evening light outside the clinic had turned to gold, filtering through the window blinds in soft, fragmented lines that stretched across the floor like quiet reminders of time passing. Inside the exam room, the atmosphere had changed, the weight of certainty replaced by the tingling edge of a question. What if this wasn't cancer? Ellie stood in front of the light board, her hands planted on the counter, her eyes locked on the X-ray films that had once delivered a death sentence. The same cloudy masses that had looked like tumors now appeared less threatening, less defined, and more mysterious. She studied them again this time, without the filter of fear or assumption, and with the memory of Milo's alertness still fresh in her mind. Behind her, Elias paced quietly, one hand running through his graying hair. He wasn't speaking. He didn't need to. The tension in his posture said everything. The guarded hope, the skepticism, the weight of months spent preparing to lose his only remaining companion. Ellie turned to him slowly, her voice gentle but sure. "These don't look like tumors." Elias stopped pacing. "You're certain I'm not ready to say certain," she replied. "But I'm saying confident, and getting more confident with every scan I review." She tapped the largest of the shadowy shapes on the X-ray. "Look at this here in the lower intestine. It's rounded dense in some places, irregular in others. That's not typical of cancer. This could be a foreign object. Maybe several." Elias stepped closer, eyes squinting at the illuminated film. "You're saying he ate something?" Ellie nodded. "That's what I'm starting to think, but that doesn't make sense. I mean, he's careful. I've seen him turn away from chicken bones. He's not a trash dog." Ellie gave him a look kind, but direct. "Has he had a change in behavior? Appetite, energy, mood swings?" Elias sighed, shoulders slumping as the truth began to uncoil inside his memory. He turned, leaning back against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. He stopped playing a few months ago. Used to run laps around the fire station courtyard, chase shadows on the fence bark at the grill when I forgot to clean it. Then he started sleeping more. Lost weight. I thought it was age, maybe depression, grieving. Grieving, Ellie echoed gently. "Yeah," Elias said. "Linda, my wife." He took a breath, deep and hard, the kind that had to be forced out from somewhere below memory. "She passed away 3 months ago. Cancer. It happened so fast it felt like I didn't even have time to breathe. One minute we were planning another round of treatment, the next. I was holding her hand, saying goodbye. His voice cracked just for a moment, but he didn't look away. Milo was there the whole time. Slept next to her bed, refused to eat unless she was awake. Didn't leave her side for the last 4 days. After she was gone, he started chewing through things. Socks, blankets, even the power cord to her oxygen machine. I thought it was stress. Maybe he was just acting out. Ellie's eyes softened, and when she spoke again, it was quieter. That's not uncommon. Dogs process grief in very real ways, especially working dogs. They bond deeply not just to the person, but to the routine, the role. When that role disappears, they lose their job, Elias said. And maybe their reason. Ellie nodded. Exactly. She returned to the scans, flipping to a side view that revealed even more irregular shapes in Milo's digestive tract. "I think what we're seeing here is a case of pica-compulsive ingestion of non-food objects. Often psychological in origin, it can stem from anxiety, trauma, boredom, or loss." Elias finished. "Yes." There was a long pause. Elias moved to the exam table where Milo was resting with his head slightly raised, one ear flopped sideways, his breathing steadier now than it had been earlier. Elias placed a hand on the pup's shoulder. "You were trying to tell me," he murmured. "You were showing me the whole time, weren't you?" Milo didn't respond in any dramatic way. He simply blinked slowly, his tail giving one slow wag as if acknowledging the truth finally spoken aloud. Ellie glanced back over her shoulder. "Do you remember what kinds of things he chewed or swallowed?" Elias furrowed his brow, thinking back through the fog of those weeks following Linda's death. There were the socks, a corner of one of her scarves. I found part of her heating pad chewed through. Oh, and he got into a basket of laundry one day, dragged out one of Linda's old robes, and shredded it. I thought he was trying to make a bed out of it, but now... Ellie nodded. That could be enough. If he swallowed pieces of fabric string, maybe even plastic or foam, they could have accumulated, caused blockages, intestinal swelling, all of it mimicking the symptoms of organ failure. But he's been eating, Elias said. Not well, but he eats. Intermittent digestion, Ellie explained. Sometimes the objects move just enough to allow food to pass. Other times they swell or reposition. That's why the symptoms come and go: vomiting, fatigue, bloating, refusal to eat, then brief periods of seeming normal again. Elias shook his head, jaw clenched with a mix of guilt and disbelief. And the last vet looked at this and called it cancer. Ellie didn't speak for a moment. When she did, her tone was careful. It happens. Sometimes the symptoms align too closely, especially in older dogs, and Milo's emotional state would have backed up the assumption: the lethargy, the weight loss, the eye dullness. It's easy to mistake grief for resignation. She looked directly at Elias now, but he wasn't giving up. He was asking for help, in the only way he knew how. Elias exhaled, stepped back, and rubbed a hand over his face. "So what do we do?" "We need confirmation," Ellie said already, walking toward the cabinet. "An ultrasound would help, but honestly, I'd prefer exploratory imaging and potentially surgery. If I'm right, and this is a mass of ingested material, we need to remove it before it ruptures anything. If I'm wrong?" She trailed off for only a second, then continued. "If I'm wrong, we'll know once and for all. But I'd rather be wrong trying to save his life than right in helping him die." Elias turned back to Milo, who was now watching Ellie with a quiet, steady gaze. "You've always been stubborn," he said to the puppy. "Even when you were 3 months old and tried to chew your way through the front seat of my truck. You never gave up then. I should have known better." Milo lifted his head slightly, ears twitching at the familiar tone of Elias's voice. Ellie returned with a portable scanner and a nurse trailing behind her. "Let's check his abdomen first. We'll go step by step." They began the scan, Milo calm under the soft hum of the device as Ellie carefully guided it across his belly. The screen flickered in grays and whites, and soon enough there it was unmistakable. A tangled cluster of irregular shadows. Not tumors, not growths, obstructions. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "There it is." Elias leaned in. "That's not supposed to be there, right?" Ellie confirmed. "That's fabric. Maybe some plastic. It's consistent with foreign body ingestion." Elias stood still for a long moment as the truth swept over him, heavy, humbling, yet somehow bright. His dog wasn't dying. He was clogged up with grief, literally and figuratively, his tiny body carrying the weight of loss in the only way it knew how. And all along he had been trying to hold on. Ellie set the scanner aside, already reaching for the phone to schedule a surgical consult. "I want to operate tonight," she said. "Every hour counts." Elias nodded. "Do whatever it takes." She smiled briefly. "I will." As she turned to prepare the necessary steps, Milo reached out again, not with a paw this time, but with his eyes following Ellie across the room as if to say, "Thank you." Because sometimes survival isn't about dramatic rescues or miracle diagnoses. Sometimes it's about listening a little closer, looking a little deeper, and being willing to ask again, what if we're wrong? And as the clinic filled with motion paperwork and quiet urgency, Elias sat beside his friend, resting a hand on Milo's side and feeling the small but steady thump of life within him. There was still a long road ahead. But now they had a direction. Now they had a name for the enemy. And for the first time in weeks, they had a chance to fight back. The clinic lights dimmed in the hallway as evening slid into night, the sun already gone behind the hills, leaving a soft indigo hue against the windows. The surgical prep room was silent for now, cold steel and sterile surfaces reflecting the low overhead lights waiting. Inside the exam room, Elias sat beside the metal table where Milo lay swaddled in a warmed blanket, a tiny IV taped to one paw, saline dripping slowly, rhythmically, the only sound filling the quiet, tense space. Ellie stood just beyond the doorframe, phone still in hand, her voice soft but precise as she spoke to the surgeon on the other end. Her brows furrowed in concentration, but behind them lived something else. A quiet fire, the kind only lit when someone truly believes they're fighting for something that still has hope. When she stepped back into the room, Elias looked up, eyes tired but searching. "Dr. Martinez is on his way," she said gently. "He's the best we've got. 45 minutes out." Elias nodded slowly, his hand still resting on Milo's side. "Thank you for calling him," he murmured. Ellie shook her head. "Thank you for not giving up." But even as she said it, a new worry settled in the room. The unspoken truth that lingered like fog between them. Milo was slipping. His temperature was dropping, blood pressure wavering. Every tick of the clock narrowed the window. And then came the next question, the practical one. "How much will this cost?" Elias asked quietly. Ellie hesitated, then answered as gently as she could. "With surgery, anesthesia monitoring, ICU care, and post-op, you're looking at a minimum of $4,000. Elias closed his eyes, exhaling slowly through his nose. The number wasn't shocking. He had expected it would be high, but hearing it aloud made it heavier, more real. He opened his wallet instinctively, more from muscle memory than logic, thumbing through a few worn bills and faded cards. "I can put down 1,000, he said. "Maybe 1,200, but I'd have to clear out my savings. There's some left in the firehouse account too, but it's not much." His voice cracked, and when he spoke again, it was quieter. "I retired early, after Linda. I thought maybe I could slow down, watch Benji grow up, fix up the house." Ellie knelt beside the table, looking not at Elias, but at Milo, whose breathing had turned shallow again, each rise and fall more delicate than the last. "I know what he meant to you," she said softly. "And I know what he still means. That's why I'm going to try something." Elias blinked. "Try what?" "There's a fund," Ellie said. "A grant set up for working dogs, canines, search and rescue therapy animals. It covers emergency surgeries, especially for dogs that have served in the community." She stood up, pulling a folder from her shelf and flipping through the pages quickly. "Milo qualifies. He saved lives, mine included." Her voice grew firmer now, almost fiery. "I'm going to submit the request tonight. I'll call in a favor. They've fast-tracked cases before. I'll make sure they do it again." Elias looked at her, stunned by the urgency and certainty in her tone. "Ellie?" She turned fierce and focused. "I know bureaucracy, but I also know what this dog did. He deserves a chance, and we're going to get it for him." As she stepped out to start the paperwork, Elias leaned down close to Milo's ear. "You hear that, kid? You're getting called a hero again." Just then, the clinic's front door opened, a gust of wind following behind the silhouettes of two people entering. Elias turned in time to see Clara, his daughter, walk in holding little Benji's hand. Behind them came Elias's father, Walter, tall and wiry, his cane tapping gently against the tile floor. Clara rushed over, her expression tight with worry, but held together by purpose. "Ellie called me," she said quickly. "Told me everything." She opened her purse and began pulling out envelopes. "There's still some money from Mom's memorial fund, and we've got emergency savings. I already texted the rest of the family." Walter, slower but still determined, stepped forward and held out a folded check. "Won a poker game last month," he said gruffly. "Didn't tell anyone. Figured now's as good a time as any." And then Benji, small and quiet, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, edges worn and smudged from too many adventures. "This is from my robot piggy bank," he said. "Milo saved Grandma, and he plays fetch with me. He's my friend." Elias couldn't speak. He took the bill with trembling fingers and crouched to look Benji in the eye. "That's the bravest $20 I've ever seen." In that moment, surrounded by his family, Elias felt something shift, not just the weight of the decision, but the shape of it. What had felt like impending loss was now something else, a mission, the kind they used to take on together at the station. Only this time, it was personal, and the one they were rescuing had once rescued them all. Ellie returned a few minutes later, her voice vibrating with energy. "They approved partial coverage," she said, breathless. "The fund's committing up to $2,000 with more pending if needed. It's enough to greenlight surgery tonight." Elias blinked rapidly, overwhelmed. "You did that?" "No," she said softly. "Milo did." They still remember his name. And then the door swung open once more, and in stepped Dr. Martinez. Tall, composed, sleeves rolled up, and eyes sharp, he gave Ellie a brief nod before turning to Elias. "I got your call," he said simply. "Let's save your dog." Elias stared at him for a moment, then reached out and shook his hand, gripping it tighter than necessary. "Thank you for coming." Martinez nodded once. "I'll need 10 minutes to prep. Then we begin." As the surgical team got into motion tools, sterilized lights, adjusted anesthetic prepared. Elias remained beside Milo, his hand never leaving the pup's side. Ellie handed him a fresh blanket and gently removed the collar around Milo's neck, placing it into Elias's palm. "Time to say your goodbye," she said quietly. Elias nodded. He bent low, forehead touching Milo's soft fur. "Hey, little man," he whispered. "I don't know what's waiting for you in there, but I know what's waiting out here. We're all rooting for you. Every last one of us." He placed his hand gently on Milo's chest, the same spot where, just days ago, Milo had lifted a paw to touch his heart. And for a moment, it was as if time folded into itself, the old firehouse days, the smoke and sirens, Linda's laughter in the backyard, the scent of warm socks stolen by a playful mouth, all of it returning in waves too large to hold, but too precious to ignore. "You brought me back from more than one fire," Elias said, voice low. "Bring yourself back from this one, please." The door opened. Ellie nodded. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, and Milo was wheeled away, the clinking of metal wheels echoing softly down the hallway as the doors closed behind him. Outside, the night deepened. But for the first time in days, Elias didn't feel the cold. He sat in the waiting room, surrounded by family, by warmth, by memory. And somewhere beyond the surgical lights, a tiny chest still rose and fell fragile, but fighting. The surgical lights buzzed faintly above the operating table, casting a cold, clinical glow across Milo's fragile body. His chest, shaved and prepped, rose and fell under the mechanical rhythm of anesthesia. Tubes snaked from machines, to paw from mouth to monitor. The silence was thick, broken only by the beep, beep of a steady heartbeat and the occasional sharp rustle of gloves against surgical drapes. Dr. Martinez stood tall, focused, every movement precise, every breath measured. It had been 2 hours since the first incision. 2 hours of careful exploration through soft tissue, navigating inflamed organs and congested intestines, searching for the hidden enemies that had been silently choking Milo from within. He worked with the calm of someone who had seen too many close calls, the kind of calm that didn't come from confidence, but from necessity. Because here, under the sterile lights, emotions were a luxury. Doubt could not have a voice. Only skill, only discipline, only instinct. "Clamp," he said. The assistant handed it over without a word. And then finally came the first discovery. Dr. Martinez gently lifted it with forceps, a balled-up piece of torn foam sponge, compacted and discolored, lodged tightly in a loop of Milo's small intestine. The edges were reddened, the tissue around it inflamed and dangerously close to rupturing. "Here's one," he said quietly. "Let's keep going." What followed felt less like surgery and more like excavation. Piece after piece emerged a tangled bundle of thread, the corner of a sock, a chewed rubber button, and most heartbreaking of all, a thin ribbon of torn electrical wire. 11 separate objects, each small on their own, but together a deadly wall inside a dog that had never given up on anyone. He was eating whatever he could find, the surgical nurse whispered, her voice cracking. "Poor thing." Dr. Martinez didn't reply, but his eyes hardened. They all understood now Milo hadn't been dying from cancer. He had been fading slowly, silently from grief and confusion. From a world that had shifted too fast, one where a warm voice had vanished, where the woman who once scratched his ears no longer sat on the porch, waiting for him. The death Elias thought he saw coming had never been about disease. It had been about loneliness. And Milo had been swallowing the world just to feel something again, Flush Martinez ordered. He worked methodically to clean the intestinal tract, gently reconnecting the healthy segments, suturing each layer with careful precision. Time felt like it had disappeared not just for him, but for everyone in the building. Back in the waiting room, time had taken on a different shape entirely. Clara sat on the edge of her seat, her hands locked tightly around Benji's. The boy had stopped asking how much longer a while ago, as if he'd realized that time wasn't real anymore. That in this room the minutes only moved when someone came through the door. Walter sat in the corner, a paper cup of cold coffee in his hand, unmoving eyes fixed on the floor. The old man had survived 2 wars, 2 recessions, and a heart bypass. But nothing frayed him like this. Ellie paced quietly near the window phone in hand, updating the rescue fund with hourly reports, her voice composed, but her eyes darting constantly to the back hallway, listening for footsteps, for doors, for news. And Elias, he stood. He had been standing for hours, unmoving just outside the swinging doors that led to the operating room. Arms crossed, back straight, like a fireman waiting for the flames to answer back. He hadn't spoken in a long time. His eyes never left the door. To anyone else, he looked frozen. But inside, he was a storm. He kept seeing Linda's face, the way she used to sing to Milo when he was still small enough to sleep in her lap, the way she used to tell Elias, "That dog's going to live longer than both of us," just out of spite. He thought of the night she passed, how Milo sat for hours beside the empty bed, tail still, ears down, eyes locked on nothing. And then he thought of Milo's paw on his chest just days ago, the last message before the world tried to turn off the light. "Don't go yet. Please don't go yet." Elias blinked hard and looked back at the clock. 3 hours. The lights above the double doors flickered. And then footsteps. The doors pushed open gently, and Dr. Martinez stepped through. The room didn't move. No one breathed. His gown was still splattered faintly with blood. His gloves were gone. His hair was damp with sweat. But his face carried the kind of expression that didn't need words. Still, he spoke them. He made it. A sound escaped from Clara, half sob, half gasp. Benji jumped up, wrapping his arms around his mom as she bent to hug him tightly. Walter exhaled and dropped his cup. It rolled across the tile unnoticed. Elias remained still. He blinked once, and then took a step forward. "He's alive." Dr. Martinez nodded. Still under, still critical, but his heart held. His lungs are strong. We removed 11 foreign objects from his digestive tract. I've never seen a dog so stubborn, or so lucky. Ellie stepped forward, her voice breaking. "What are his chances?" The surgeon's tone softened. "We're through the worst. He'll need antibiotics, close monitoring, and a lot of rest. But if he fights like he did in there, he's got more than a chance." And then Elias moved, not a fast movement, but one full of weight of decades of memories, suddenly given breath again. He walked to the doctor, extended a hand, then pulled him into a brief, rough embrace. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for bringing him back." Martinez stepped back, clearing his throat. "He's not quite back yet, but I think he wants to be." In the recovery room, Milo lay beneath soft blankets, his breathing assisted by a machine, his paws twitching slightly as if even in sleep he still wanted to move forward. His fur was damp with antiseptic. His stomach was stitched in a clean line, the wound fresh but healing. Ellie stood beside the bed, checking vitals, adjusting the oxygen flow. She had been trained to remain detached in moments like these, to treat, not to feel. But this wasn't just any patient. She leaned close and whispered, "You were right all along, weren't you? You knew you weren't done yet." And though Milo didn't stir, a faint shift passed through his tail, a twitch so small it could have been mistaken for a spasm. But to Ellie, it was more than that. It was a reply. That night, the clinic stayed open well past closing. No one wanted to leave. Elias pulled a chair beside Milo's recovery bed and sat with his hand gently resting against the edge of the blanket. Clara brought hot chocolate for the staff. Benji drew a picture of Milo with a cape declaring him Super Dog. Walter called the firehouse and left a message, the kids still in the fight. And somewhere in the soft stillness, Milo continued to breathe. Soft, shallow, steady. A dog who had nearly been mourned, now moving slowly back toward the light. A dog who had once pulled a little girl from fire and now from within his own darkness was clawing his way back to life. And as the clock ticked quietly toward midnight, Elias reached down, touched the same spot on Milo's chest where he had felt a heartbeat once before, and whispered, "Keep fighting, buddy. The story's not over." Morning broke gently through the half-shaded windows of the recovery room, the kind of morning light that didn't rush, didn't intrude. It simply existed, soft and golden, like a quiet hand brushing across the forehead of the world. The clinic was still save for the quiet beeping of monitors and the low hum of machines keeping rhythm with the breath of a small sleeping patient. Milo stirred. At first, it was imperceptible, a twitch in the paw, a slow, uncertain blink of one eye against the sterile white ceiling. Then a flick of the ear, and finally, as the seconds passed with almost sacred silence, a small, tired wag of his thin tail brushed softly against the folded towel beneath him. He was awake. Barely, but awake. And when Elias leaned over the side of the recovery crate, his beard unshaven, eyes heavy with days of worry and nights without sleep, Milo's gaze found his. It wasn't full of energy, it wasn't even fully focused, but there was a recognition there, quiet and unmistakable. "Hey, partner," Elias whispered, his voice cracking like an old record left too long in the sun. "You're still with me." At the sound of that voice, Milo blinked slowly, then as if gathering the last ounce of strength in his limbs, tried to lift his head. It didn't rise much, barely an inch, but it was enough. His body was still heavy with medication and pain, but something in him knew this moment mattered. Ellie stepped quietly into the room, a clipboard in hand, but her pace slowed the second she saw the wagging tail and the open eyes. A smile formed, not the clinical professional kind, but the kind that pulled from memory, from hope, from something deeply human. "He's awake," she said softly. Soon the others arrived. Clara walked in with a thermos of tea and a soft blanket slung over her shoulder. When she saw Milo looking up, her breath caught in her throat. She knelt beside Elias, her hand reaching into the crate as she gently ran her fingers behind Milo's ear the way Linda used to. "You scared us," she said, laughing through tears. "But you're still here, little one." Then came Walter, moving slower than usual, but with more purpose than anyone had seen in years. He didn't say much. He simply crouched, let Milo sniff his knuckles, and nodded once like a soldier paying respect to another. And finally, Benji. The boy didn't rush in, didn't shout with joy. He walked carefully to the side of the crate, eyes wide and shining, carrying something in his small hands, a red bandana folded into a neat square. It had once belonged to Milo, back when his frame had been fuller, stronger. Benji unfolded it and held it to the bars. "I kept it for you," he whispered. "I didn't let anyone wash it." Milo's nose twitched. He shifted slightly forward, pressing his snout gently to the fabric. His body quivered with exhaustion, but in that touch was something more than scent. It was memory. It was connection. It was home. "I knew you wouldn't leave me," Benji added, leaning his forehead gently against the crate. "I just knew it." Ellie let the moment breathe before stepping forward again. Her tone calm but clear, speaking not just to the family but to Milo too. "He's weak, but he's responding exactly as we'd hoped," she said. "He knows where he is. He knows who you are. That's a very good sign." Elias nodded, eyes still on the little black and tan face, watching them all. "What now?" he asked quietly. Ellie crouched beside him. "I want to talk to you about what happened," she began, choosing her words slowly, with care. "We used to believe that when animals engaged in harmful eating behavior, chewing socks, swallowing cords, tearing into trash, it was just about boredom or mischief. But now, especially with service or companion dogs, we understand it's more complex." Elias looked at her, listening closely. "Milo wasn't just eating things randomly," she continued. "He was grieving. He lost Linda, someone who was a central emotional anchor in his life. And without her, he lost his rhythm, his sense of safety, even his purpose." Clara's hand tightened around Elias's. Benji looked confused. "What's purpose?" he asked. Elias smiled gently. "It's when someone feels they have a reason to wake up in the morning, a job to do, a mission, and dogs need that. Especially dogs like Milo," she said. "He was trained to support, to search, to care. When that mission ended and he wasn't given a new one, the grief filled in the silence. That's when anxiety starts to turn inward. And that's when they begin to harm themselves without understanding why." Elias looked down at Milo again. The way the pup now breathed easier, surrounded by familiar voices, by warmth, by home. "So what do we do?" Elias asked. Ellie paused, then smiled thoughtfully. "We give him a new mission." Clara leaned in, curious. "Like, what kind of mission? Something to engage both his body and his mind. A task that means connection, comfort. He still has his scent, recognition, his memory. His instincts are intact. That's rare after what he's been through." "You're saying he could work again?" Walter asked, brows lifted. "I'm saying," Ellie said slowly, "he could heal again. If and only if we give him something worth healing for." Benji lit up, like a superhero coming back. Ellie nodded, chuckling. Exactly like that. For a moment, silence fell, the good kind. The kind that doesn't come from fear or waiting, but from everyone in the room, realizing that hope had taken a different shape. That what was once an ending might actually be a beginning. Elias stood and looked down at Milo once more. "You've always had a mission, haven't you?" he said. "Saving others, watching over us. Maybe it's time we gave you a mission where you don't have to carry it alone." Milo blinked slowly, eyes still drowsy from the painkillers, but calm, at peace. As the family took turns offering him soft words, quiet touches, small pieces of their presence, Ellie stepped out of the room and returned with a small whiteboard. On it, she wrote something in blue marker: "New mission for Milo Heal. Train. Connect." She taped it to the wall above his crate. Then, before leaving, she leaned close one more time, her voice so soft it was meant only for him. "There's more to you than anyone thought, little guy. and I think the world still needs you." That night, the family returned home promising to be back early. But Elias stayed. He refused to leave Milo alone, dragging a chair beside the crate and settling in for the night. He brought a book, Linda's favorite, and read aloud quietly, not for himself but for Milo, just like she used to. And when he paused to sip water or rest his voice, Milo's eyes never left him, as if listening, as if remembering, as if healing. And outside, beyond the windows of the quiet clinic, the town slept unaware that, in one small room, a dog who had been written off had just been given a second life. And a family who nearly said goodbye had found something worth holding on to. But in the coming days, the question would remain: what kind of mission could bring back Milo's spirit? Completely, 6 months later, the world looked different. Not because the town had changed, or the fire station had been painted fresh, or the leaves had returned to the trees after winter's hush, but because of one small presence who padded through the corridors of people's hearts on 4 steady paws. Milo was back. Not as the same puppy who once ran wild in the yard behind Elias's home, chasing sunbeams and rolling in grass. He was smaller now, his frame still lean from the long recovery, his movements sometimes cautious, but there was a gravity to him, a quiet attentiveness, like he understood things that no ordinary dog could. And perhaps in some way he did. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning just before 9 a.m., the rust-red doors of the Maple Hollow fire station would swing open, and Milo, wearing his tiny custom vest stitched with the patch "Therapy Dog," in service, would step inside. He walked with the kind of presence that made grown men pause, even the ones who had faced explosions and collapsed roofs, because something about the way Milo carried himself reminded them of everything they'd seen and everything they still carried. At first, some were skeptical. Therapy dogs, sure, they'd heard of them, seen a few even. But a puppy barely over a year old, with paws that still looked too soft to know the rough ground of real suffering. But then, he'd sit beside them, not barking, not licking, just sitting, silent, present. And slowly the walls would fall. There was something disarming about him, especially for the firefighters battling PTSD, those who'd survived collapses, pulled bodies from fires, and buried more colleagues than they cared to count. Milo didn't ask them to talk. He didn't judge when the tears came. He simply leaned in, pressed that warm little body beside their boot, or rested his chin on a trembling knee, and somehow, in that soft contact, something inside them loosened. One man, a paramedic named Jordan, hadn't spoken in group therapy for 4 months. He'd witnessed a child's final breath during a school bus accident and had since retreated into a shell of silence. But the first time Milo curled up at his feet, Jordan's hand had instinctively dropped to stroke the puppy's back. 15 minutes later, with Milo's steady weight against him, Jordan spoke 3 words: "I miss her." It was the beginning of his return. Word spread quickly, as it often does in small towns. Soon widows' parents, even teenagers who'd suffered loss, came to the community hall on Thursdays, where a new pilot program had begun. Companion paws, emotional support for emergency families. And at the center of it all always was Milo, the smallest among them, but somehow the strongest. His vest was soon adorned with pins, one for every life he helped change. A silver one from Chief Dawson, who said Milo made him feel his late brother was still nearby. A gold one from a little girl named Sophie, who hadn't spoken since her father died in a crash until she whispered her first new word while hugging Milo's safe. Ellie, now 6 months pregnant and glowing in the way only expectant mothers do, when they're surrounded by purpose, had become a key figure in the program. She split her time between the vet clinic and companion paws, running therapy sessions, training volunteers, and coordinating Milo's weekly schedule with military-like precision. She never once mentioned that it was Milo who had saved her life 9 years earlier. But sometimes, when no one else was around, she'd kneel beside him and whisper soft Vietnamese lullabies, brushing her fingers gently behind his ear. And he would close his eyes as if he still remembered the soot-filled apartment, the way she had trembled, the way he had curled around her like a promise. And then there was Elias. If you had seen him a year ago, shoulders curved forward like the weight of grief had physically reshaped his spine, eyes dulled with loss, his laughter long buried with Linda. You wouldn't recognize him now, not because he had returned to the loud, booming man he once was, but because the quiet had softened into something else. Not silence, but peace. He smiled more. He talked to strangers again. He brought Benji to the station on Saturdays, where they'd clean Milo's vest together or bake peanut butter treats shaped like tiny fire helmets. He even let the boy sleep over some nights, watching movies with the volume low, Milo curled like a comma between them on the couch. "Is this what a home feels like?" again, Elias once whispered, his hand resting on Milo's sleeping form. Clara, watching from the hallway, wiped her eyes and didn't answer. She didn't have to. At the town's spring festival that year, a special booth was set up right near the gazebo Meet Milo, the youngest therapy dog in Maple Hollow. Children flocked to pet him. Adults came just to sit quietly nearby, some offering stories, others just seeking a kind of stillness they hadn't felt in months. The mayor gave a speech. Local reporters filmed a short feature called Paws That Heal. One news clip showed Milo sitting on the stage beside Elias as the fire chief handed him a certificate of recognition, a small framed award with gold trim that read, "For service, courage, and connection, Milo Maple Hollow's heart." And though Milo couldn't read the way his ears twitched and his tail gently wagged when Elias crouched beside him, told everyone in that crowd he understood. Later that night, after the crowd had gone home, and the stars began climbing the sky like quiet guardians, Elias stood on his porch holding a cup of tea. Ellie sat beside him, a thick cardigan wrapped around her belly. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that some souls are born knowing exactly who they need to save?" Elias looked down at Milo, asleep on the rug, breathing evenly, chest rising and falling like a metronome for the rhythm of their new life. "I think some souls don't wait for permission," he said. "They just show up, like he did." Ellie nodded, her hands resting gently on her growing belly. "Benji asked me if I thought the baby will be a helper like Milo." Elias chuckled. "That boy sees the world in ways I never could." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustle the trees and the distant sound of laughter from a neighbor's window. Then Ellie spoke again, her voice softer. "You know what I think," she said. "I think Milo's story, it's not just about survival. It's about what happens after. About staying. About choosing to stay." Elias looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since Linda died, he didn't feel that tight pull in his chest. He didn't feel like he was betraying the past by stepping into the present. He just felt whole. Inside the hallway, light flicked off. Milo stirred slightly, then stilled, curling tighter. And beneath that quiet roof in the little house that had once held only silence, something more powerful had settled in. Not just hope, belonging. But even as the days passed with gentle routine, even as the town embraced Milo as more than just a dog, as a healer, a listener, a bridge between pain and recovery, something unexpected was about to rise. A stranger had been watching. Not from cruelty, but from curiosity. Someone who knew what it meant to lose. Someone who needed what Milo gave. And in the weeks to come, a new shadow would fall across the fire station's door. Not a danger, but a call. A child. Alone. Shaking, unable to speak. And it would be Milo's nose again that would find the key. The morning light touched everything, with a gentleness that made even the pavement look soft, as if the world itself had paused for a breath before opening its eyes again. The old road leading up to Pineview residences was quieter than Elias remembered, though time had painted over most of the memories with new bricks, fresh windows, and bright signage. The fire-blackened walls and splintered stairwells that once haunted this place were gone. In their place stood a renewed building, sturdy, hopeful, clean, but Elias still saw it as it had been that day. He stepped out of the truck, one hand resting on the doorframe, the other loosely curled around the leash, though Milo hardly needed it anymore. The little shepherd puppy, now calm and composed in his therapy vest, stepped onto the sidewalk with careful paws, his nose lifting instinctively into the air. It had been 9 years since that morning, since the smoke, the screams, the frantic search through collapsing wood and hot steel. But today wasn't about trauma. Today was about returning and honoring the story that began here, even if it had taken nearly a decade to understand it fully. Elias looked down at the small dog beside him, fur-brushed neat vest, snug ears perked. "You ready, partner?" Milo looked up with those amber eyes that had once stared down death and decided to stay. His tail gave a slow, dignified wag. The entrance to Pineview was flanked now with blooming dogwoods and a short stone plaque that read, "Rebuilt. Remembered. Reimagined." Elias traced the edge of the words with his eyes as he passed heart-heavy, but no longer weighed down. He and Milo walked slowly through the newly paved courtyard, past benches with brass dedication plates and flower beds shaped like stars. Every few steps, someone smiled or waved. It seemed people remembered the story, the one about the little puppy that wouldn't leave a burning building until the girl he'd found was safe. Halfway across the square, Elias knelt. His knees weren't as quick to bend these days, and the concrete wasn't gentle, but none of that mattered. He gathered Milo gently in his arms, pressing his forehead against the soft fur between the puppy's ears. "You saved more than just lives in that fire," he whispered. "You saved Ellie. You saved me. You brought Benji back to laughter. You gave this whole town something to believe in again. But more than that, you reminded me what family means." Milo leaned in his head, resting against Elias's chest. The small heartbeat Elias felt there was steady, warm a rhythm that had carried him through the darkest seasons. As they stayed like that, just a man and his dog surrounded by echoes of the past, a voice called gently from the path behind. "I thought I might find you here today." Elias turned. Ellie Tran, Ellie's mother, stood with a sun hat in one hand and a small bundle of flowers in the other. Her hair was more silver than when he'd last seen her, and the lines on her face were deeper, but her eyes still held the calm kindness he remembered. She had retired from the school district last year, but she looked just as purposeful now as she had then. "I come by once a month," she said, kneeling slowly beside them. "Sometimes just to sit, sometimes to pray, but always to remember." Milo patted over and gently pressed his nose against her arm. Amanda dropped the flowers and cupped his face, her voice catching. "Do you know how many times I thought you were just a miracle? We imagined," she whispered. "But you were real. You were real then, and you're still real now. My four-legged miracle." Tears welled in her eyes as she stroked the fur behind his ears. "You found my baby when no one else could. You didn't leave her. You stayed with her in the dark when the rest of the world forgot. And you gave her back to me." Milo's tail moved in soft sweeps, his head nudging her hand. She kissed the top of his head. "And now you give yourself to everyone," she added. "This town doesn't even realize the depth of what you've done. But I do. I always will." The three of them sat in silence after that, surrounded by the distant laughter of children from a playground, nearby the soft hum of wind through trees. It felt like the world was breathing with them. Then Amanda opened her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "This came in the mail last week," she said. "Ellie wanted me to bring it. It's from someone you helped." Elias raised an eyebrow as he took the envelope and unfolded the note inside. It was handwritten neat but emotional. To Milo and the people who love him. You don't know me, but I was at one of the therapy sessions this spring. I'd lost my brother in a fire last year and couldn't even say his name out loud without shaking. But Milo just sat with me. He didn't move, didn't push, just waited. And in that waiting, something inside me opened. That day was the first time I told anyone the truth. That I blamed myself. That I hadn't saved him. That I didn't say goodbye. And somehow, in that quiet moment, I felt forgiven. I wanted to give back. I asked around, and I heard others felt the same. So we started something. A fund, in Milo's name, for other dogs like him, for other souls who stay. Elias's hands trembled slightly as he read the final line. Because some endings aren't endings at all. They're beginnings in disguise. Amanda smiled softly as Elias looked up. It's called the Milo Therapy Fund, she said. We've already raised enough to train 3 new puppies. Elias stared down at the little dog resting at his feet. You hear that, bud? You're training the next generation now. Milo lifted his head as if in recognition, then gave a gentle sneeze, one of those soft, silly sounds that always made Benji giggle uncontrollably. They laughed together, Elias and Amanda, and for a moment it felt like the fire had never happened. Like the pain had simply folded itself into something softer, more manageable. Something like grace. As they stood and began walking back toward the truck, Amanda reached out and touched Elias's arm. I see it in you too, she said. The healing. He met her eyes. Some days are still hard. She nodded. They always will be. But now, you're not alone in them. Elias looked up at the sky, bright and open, and let the sunlight wash over his face. His lungs filled fully deeply, not out of habit, but out of intention. Milo hopped into the passenger seat of the truck, curling up on the worn flannel blanket that had become his favorite. Elias paused before closing the door, one hand on the roof. He looked back at the building once more, not as a tomb of memory, but as a monument of what had been survived. Back home, Clara would be making lunch. Benji would be practicing writing Milo's name in bubble letters. And Ellie, belly round and glowing with the weight of new life, would be sorting through baby onesies while humming something soft and slow. Everything had changed. Everything had begun again. And as Elias turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from the curb, Milo shifted, resting his head on Elias's thigh. The rhythm of the road vibrated gently beneath them. They didn't need words. They never had. But if Milo could speak, Elias knew exactly what he'd say. I'm still here. And in the quiet that followed, Elias felt something rise. Not sorrow, not even joy, but a strange, glowing stillness that whispered through his bones. The ending was never the end. It was only the place where the light found a way back in. The morning sun spilled through the sycamore trees lining the school's parking lot, casting broken shadows on the pavement, where small feet hurried past in bright sneakers and lunchboxes swung like pendulums from eager little arms. Inside the classroom, the air was filled with soft whispers, the rustle of papers, and the kind of nervous anticipation only children could generate when something or someone extraordinary was about to enter the room. Benji stood by the open classroom door, his hands clasped tight in front of him, his backpack hanging unevenly off one shoulder, and a grin spreading so wide it nearly met his ears. Behind him, Elias waited with one hand resting gently on the head of the young shepherd, who sat by his side calm and watchful. His vest freshly brushed, his name stitched in soft blue letters above a small patch that read, Therapy Companion. Certified. Milo. His fur had filled out again, rich with health, thick around the shoulders and neck, soft down his spine. His eyes, those endlessly expressive amber eyes, swept the hallway with a quiet confidence that came not from age or dominance, but from a kind of knowing. Only the soul remembers he had survived the fire, the loss, the pain. And now, he was here, whole, purposeful. Elias leaned down and murmured softly near his ear, "All right, partner. Time to meet your next crew." Milo gave a faint thump of his tail, then rose and followed Benji into the classroom. 20 little heads turned in unison, mouths agape, hands twitching in their laps with barely contained excitement. The teacher, Ms. Laurel, a warm woman with copper hair and gentle eyes, stood near the whiteboard, smiling like she already knew that this would be the day her students would talk about for months, maybe years. Benji cleared his throat, standing as tall as his 8-year-old frame could manage. "This is Milo," he said, his voice just a little too fast. "He's a therapy dog. That means when people are sad or scared or they miss someone really bad, he just stays with them, like a friend who doesn't ask questions." There was a pause. Then a small hand shot up in the back. "Can he understand us?" Benji nodded. Not like words, maybe, but like feelings. He knows when someone needs him. He just knows. Milo sat near Benji's feet, calm and still, his ears alert, tail resting gently on the floor. His gaze swept the room, not in search of threat, but in quiet invitation. One by one, the children inched closer, forming a loose half-circle around him. One girl, whose sleeves covered her hands, even though the room was warm, extended her fingers slowly until they brushed against Milo's fur. He leaned into her touch ever so slightly. Her shoulders, stiff with habit, began to relax. Another boy with thick glasses and a stutter knelt beside him and whispered something that only Milo could hear. The dog looked at him, blinked once, and let out a soft exhale. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a trick. It was just presence, honest, unfiltered, and constant. Ms. Laurel gently encouraged the kids to sit, and for the next 30 minutes, the classroom transformed into something sacred. The children shared stories about pets they'd lost, about fears of thunderstorms, about missing their grandparents, and in between every sentence Milo was there offering a paw, resting his head on a knee, leaning his warm body against whoever needed it next. Elias stood outside the window, watching quietly. He didn't want to intrude on the moment, but he also couldn't leave. Something about seeing Milo in that room, surrounded by small hearts, still learning how to be brave, filled him with a quiet awe. 6 months ago, they'd almost said goodbye forever. And now here they were on the cusp of something bigger than any of them. After class ended, Ms. Laurel invited Elias in to say a few words. He kept it short, not because he lacked things to say, but because Milo had already said it all in the language that didn't need sound. "We all go through storms," Elias said. "But sometimes the ones who carry us through them aren't the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes they've got 4 legs and ears too big for their heads." The kids laughed. Milo barked just once, and the whole room cheered like they'd been given a gift. As they left the building, Benji holding Milo's leash with proud hands, Elias looked up to see Clara waving from the truck. Ellie sat in the passenger seat, her hand resting gently over the swell of her belly, smiling as she watched her son lead the little dog with the big legacy back to the family that nearly lost him. The truck door clicked open, and Milo hopped in, settling onto the familiar blanket in the back seat. Elias buckled Benji in, then slid behind the wheel. As the truck pulled away from the school, Milo sat up slightly, pressing his nose to the window. The glass was cool beneath his chin, the world outside bathed in afternoon gold. Children spilled onto the playground, their laughter lifting into the sky. Trees swayed, clouds drifted, and somewhere in the distance a fire truck's siren rang out, not in warning, but in routine. And Milo, the dog who had once slept beside flames to protect a child, now watched a peaceful world pass by. His tail thumped softly. Clara turned in her seat and reached back to scratch behind his ears. "Big day, huh?" Milo blinked slowly, then pressed his head into her hand. When she pulled away, he he turned back toward the window. His reflection ghosted faintly in the glass. Elias glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He saw the softness in the puppy's eyes, the glimmer that danced just beneath the surface, not of exhaustion or resignation, but of quiet readiness. The kind of look that says, "I have more to give. Let me try." They passed through town by the old firehouse, by the clinic, by the park bench where Elias had once sat with his grief pressed heavy against his chest. Everything was familiar, and yet everything felt new. Home wasn't just the place you lived. It was the space you built moment by moment, heartbeat by heartbeat, with the ones who stayed. At a red light, Elias looked back and found Milo still watching the world, ears perked, nose twitching. The puppy's eyes caught his in the mirror for a moment, and it was just a moment, but in that brief exchange, Elias saw something luminous. Gratitude, hope, readiness. The light turned green. They drove on, past the shelter that now bore a small plaque outside with Milo's name on it, past the bakery where Ellie always bought peanut butter treats in bulk, past the library where Clara volunteered, past the church where Amanda sometimes lit candles just because, past all the ordinary places that had somehow been woven into the extraordinary journey of a dog who was never supposed to live this long, or mean this much, or heal this many. At the top of the last hill before home, Elias slowed the truck. He always did here. The view opened wide, the whole valley stretching beneath them rooftops like toys, the river like a silver ribbon, the late sun dripping gold across every surface. Benji leaned forward between the seats, his voice soft. "Do you think Milo knows Elias didn't have to ask what he meant?" He nodded. "Yeah. I think he always did." Milo rested his chin on the windowsill again, eyes catching the last blaze of daylight. And in that moment, simple, bright, infinite, it was clear the fire hadn't taken everything. Grief hadn't stolen the future. And endings were never really endings. Only beginnings in softer light. Because the world was still here, and Milo was ready for all that lay ahead.